Okay, so frozen embryos are better than fresh embryos. They give you a higher success rate. Fact, fiction, myth, misconception. Now, the answer is not straightforward. It really does depend on when the embryo was frozen and what type of hormonal cycle you're using to put back that frozen embryo. Now, if we rewind a little bit, when we first started doing IVF, we weren't freezing very well. So in those times, the embryos, especially when they were frozen on day 3, and a lot of embryos were, they didn't survive that freezing thawing process. So fresh was definitely better than frozen then. And that adage has stayed on with us until recently, where there's been a trend to say, let's do more frozens. Now, one of the reasons behind let's do more frozens is that there are inherent disadvantages of doing a fresh cycle, and that is to do with the advancement of the lining. Not many people may know this, but essentially the lining needs to reveal, for want of a better word, docking stations for the embryo to dock in. Now, once the lining doesn't have these docking stations revealed all the time. Once it decides to unveil or uncover those docking stations, it's uncovered for about 48 hours, and then those docking stations are gone. All right, so we have actually a very narrow window, the so-called window of implantation, where an embryo can dock. The signal, or one of the signals we think for the lining to unveil or uncover these docking stations, are high hormone levels, because that's what generally happens in the body. When hormone levels in IVF are so high, there is a small chance that the docking stations can be unveiled too early, and then by the time we're ready to put an embryo back, those docking stations are no longer there, because once they're unveiled, they're only there for 24 to 48 hours. So when we've understood that, and when freezing technologies improved, then people started to say, hey, maybe our frozen embryos do better than our fresh embryos because of that lack of a mismatch. I mean, you may argue then, well, if there is a mismatch, why don't we put the embryo back early? We can put a day 3 in to see if the docking station is revealed a bit early. But the truth of the matter is, all embryos need to develop to day 5 and hatch out of its shell before they can implant. So that is, if you put a day 3 embryo in, it'll roll around a little bit, and then roll around for a couple of days, and then it'll keep developing, and then it will, once it gets to day 5, it will start to implant. So putting an embryo in early doesn't really help that premature opening of the pre-implantation window. If we freeze an embryo, however, on day 3, the embryo is actually quite vulnerable at that stage, and it may not survive the freeze-thaw process as well as a day 5 embryo. So in that context, frozen embryos on day 3 may not be better than day 5. With a day 5 embryo, then we have also the advantage of genetic testing. So if an embryo is genetically tested and it's frozen on day 5, and we come back to use it, then obviously it's got a higher rate of implantation success than a fresh embryo that has not been tested. The nature in which a day 5 embryo or a frozen embryo gets put back, however, is important. And what I say that is, there are 2 ways of putting back a frozen day 5 embryo. One is to artificially build the lining using estrogen and progesterone sequentially. So either an HRT cycle or a program cycle, there's some different names for it, or doing something called a natural cycle or a modified natural cycle. That is where we either follow ovulation or induce ovulation, and we put a day 5 frozen embryo back roughly 5 days after ovulation, whether it's a natural ovulation or ovulation we've induced. Now, frozen embryos that are put back during a modified natural cycle do, at the very least, do as good as a fresh embryo transfer, and there are increasing studies that they do better than a fresh embryo transfer. And we think that is because of the fact that we don't have that lining mismatch, and everything is a lot more natural. And keep in mind that when we wait for ovulation, the egg that ovulates, which is not involved in making a pregnancy here, but the egg that ovulates leaves behind a shell called the corpus luteum. This is a very active hormone secreting shell, and it produces a whole bunch of hormones that is not just progesterone that helps support the pregnancy. And we think by letting the body help support the lining and any embryos that we put back, we get a better outcome. Now, when we do a HRT cycle or a programmed frozen cycle where we artificially program the lining, we actually don't have ovulation, and therefore we don't have this active hormone secreting organ called the corpus luteum. So we have no hormones that the body is naturally producing to support that pregnancy. All we have is the hormones that we're giving it: estrogen followed by progesterone. And that is a very rough way of supporting a process that is actually quite nuanced and complicated. And in those instances, the outcomes are poorer. They're certainly poorer than modified natural cycles or natural cycles. We know there are higher rates of high blood pressure in pregnancy. We know the babies are a bit smaller. We know there's increased rate of placental insufficiency when we do programmed frozen cycles. And there is some research to show that it is at the same as a fresh embryo, if not a little bit worse. So all that means is saying that, and all that means is that because we've not allowed the body's own natural organ, the corpus luteum, to produce the cocktail of hormones that is needed for pregnancy and for successful implantation, we have essentially reduced the chances of implantation for a frozen embryo than if we had let the body do its thing. Now, there are some people where this is the only choice. So some people who have premature ovarian insufficiency or early menopause, this is the only way to get a pregnancy, and it does work. It just doesn't work as well as if you put a frozen embryo in through a natural cycle. So in short, frozen better than fresh? Sometimes, but not always. Depends on the freezing and depends on the way you put that frozen embryo back.